I already made an answer key to this portion of the exam, which is another video. I'll post these two in the same place. But do you, so what we'll do is if people who are in here want to interrupt at any time and ask about specific problems, that would be more than fine with me. I think the part about the first exam was there were two versions. The one on Thursday and Friday, and then the one on Saturday and Sunday were different. The thing that was difficult about this problem was you were used to seeing total utility and then having to calculate marginal, but you can always go back to the other one using your formula that marginal utility is the change in total utility over the change in quantity. So if you knew the first total utility, you could solve for this one right here by plugging in -20 there. So I'm not going to talk too much about exam 1 parts A and B because I already made an answer key for it, very similar to this format, unless Jamie or Jesse have any questions. This one was a budget constraint-ish question just about intuition, assumptions and predictions. This one was similar, just with different numbers, and you can see me solve it all out in the other video I made. And then one where you have to graph the budget constraint. Again, just talking about how price changes make the quantity consumed ambiguous. I also went over the answer key for part B on the video I already made, so I'm not going to spend much time on it unless anyone wants to jump in with questions at any time. Part B was 35 points. The first part of the originality, I took off 1 point if you had the same market as 3 or more students, but other than that, I pretty much added points for creativity, unless you did something you had definitely seen me do before. This was the Thursday-Friday exam. Again, this is already in an existing answer key. And this was a Saturday-Sunday exam. I feel like this was one of the trickier problems on the exam for students. So when you see expectations and you know it's supply and demand, you should think expectations can shift supply and demand. So if they expect prices to be higher, consumers will buy more today, which pushes prices up. Suppliers will supply less today and hold out for those higher prices. Both of those things are going to make prices rise on their own. So that's the self-fulfilling part of expecting them to rise, actually makes them rise. But I talk about that a little more in the answer key I already recorded. So I'm going to start talking about question C because I haven't already recorded an answer key for this one. So this was another one where take-home exam, right? And grading you based on your originality. I'm doing things that are not the same as your peers and that are challenging. So 4 points for originality, creativity, but I think I only did like -1 if you were the same as 3 or more students, or -1 if you had seen it before. A lot of students did something really similar to the one the group did on the practice exam of a subsidy for electric vehicles, but that was something you had directly seen before. So because I'm not feeling incredibly creative, I'll try this Washington State carbon tax in the market for gasoline. So C1 says, considering relative elasticity of supply and demand, use a graph to explain the pros and cons of the policy. This was worth 12 points. So out of 40, that was worth 12. It was 4 for the graph, 1 for showing the initial equilibrium. I think demand is really steep because there's not many substitutes for gas and supply is relatively flat because it can be stored and held onto until prices are high. So it's easy to increase the quantity supplied if the price changes. So that's the initial equilibrium. If this is a carbon tax on producers, let's say, that means that the supply is going to be the curve that shifts to the left. Oops. That's not what I wanted. wanted a new color, all fancy. So the first thing you do after you shift the curve is always find the new tax quantity. At that quantity, there are two different prices. The price for buyers is way up here. The price for sellers is down here. Both groups are harmed by this. Use a graph to explain the pros and cons of this policy. So I need to be able to talk about these. For me, that's easier when I have letters. So I'm going to use letters to do it. When you're doing the letters for a tax, you can ignore that red line. It's an artificial manipulation by the government. There's a little tiny f in there. So at the market equilibrium, consumers used to get A, B, and E. Producers used to get C, D, and F. And the total well-being was all the letters A, B, C, D, E, and F. That's always going to be true for a tax, price ceiling, or price floor, that the market should have all the letters. And then after the tax, consumers' price went up, so they only get A, they're worse off. Producers' price went down, they only get D, they're worse off. The government counts in total well-being. We give them the benefit of the doubt. They get B and C, so they're better off. They were getting nothing before, but the total is smaller. So the deadweight loss is the difference in totals. It is E and F. So 4 of the points were for the graph. 4 of the points were for, or 8 of those 12 points were for talking about the pros and the cons and using the graph to explain. So you might have lost like 2 points if you had some consequences, but you never you didn't have a graph that you were referring to, or if you never explicitly talked about things being pros or cons. I think the real con is that this harms consumers and producers and creates deadweight loss. Say a pro is that it helps the government out and that tax revenue could be funded on things. You could say another pro is that it reduces the quantity of gas and helps climate change. And that would be enough. You just need to write a little bit more words than that, but I don't have space on the slide, but you don't need to write a ton when you're weighing pros and cons. If you don't have time, I would write it out quickly and then go back if you have more time. You might have lost a half a point if you didn't think about elasticity at all. But that was basically what you had to do for C1. C2 was worth 4 points. No, 6 points. And so for this one, how does this policy change the distribution of consumer and producer surplus? So I would say that they both fall, but because demand is more inelastic, B is bigger than C, so consumers are harmed more. They pay more of the tax. Intuitively, that's always going to be true with a tax. The insensitive consumer or the insensitive participant, the one that's like either addicted to the good and needs to consume it no matter the price, or kind of stuck producing the good and will produce it regardless of what price does, that person is always going to bear the brunt of the tax policy. Would a more elastic demand curve make it more likely that producers benefit from the policy? No, producers are never going to benefit from a tax. A lot of people answered this in kind of various ways. A lot of people just like wrote a lot of interesting things about elasticity, just kind of jargon, but didn't really say much. But if you want to make a case that the more elastic demand curve is going to make it more likely they benefit, it would actually make it more likely, like if this were flatter, that's going to make B smaller than C. So when demand is more elastic, that means suppliers will be more likely to pay more. So if anything, a more elastic demand curve is going to harm producers more. they will pay more of the tax. The market will shrink more because consumers are going to consume a lot less gasoline. So anything you said about that, like, would be perfectly fine. Any questions so far? I know it's kind of weird because it's just the two of you and we can't do it in person. The university got taken to orange right as I was writing my email. In person is forbidden now, but please feel free to interrupt Jesse or Jamie or just anyone from the ether. Jesse, you have a question?
No, I was just like, was running out of the shower. So I'm like just turning my camera on now.
Thanks for saying hi. I appreciate it. So that was the Thursday, Friday exam. So if you had a different version of the exam, it's always good to see more ways that I asked questions, but it looked relatively similar. So then the question says, assume policymakers are also considering a subsidy to a related market as an alternative policy with similar goals to the one that you analyzed in C1 through C2. This question was worth 10 points. Explain a market they'd be likely to subsidize and why was 2 points. They'd be likely to subsidize, I don't know, solar panels. Considering relative elasticity, draw a graph of this market, assuming this was P star and Q star, analyze the impact. So giving you a little bit more numbers. That was 4 points. Labeling those with reasonable numbers was 2 points. And how much is the total subsidy payment and how much goes to consumers was 2 points. So if we've got solar panels, because the end goal of the program is to reduce carbon, a lot of people had some strange choices of markets that would serve similar purposes. I think there was one that was about like, so always keep track of which markets you use because it's fun for me and also so I can keep track of originality. But there was one that was like a tax on cut bagels in New York City. And people were like, maybe they would subsidize the breakfast sandwich market instead. It was like, that's not really the same goal, right? If they're taxing cut bagels because they want to earn more revenue off of something that is a luxury good or something that tourists buy or something you're eating on the fly, they wouldn't instead subsidize a similar product. So you should make sure that the two policies have similar goals. I think instead that solar panels have pretty elastic demand because there are a lot of substitutes and it's a big chunk of your income, and supply is relatively inelastic because they're relatively difficult to produce and there's not that many companies that are experts in it. Have a lot of specialty inputs. So P star is 100 and we're going to need some of these numbers. Q star 10. Analyze the impact of a $20 subsidy to sellers. So now we know it's going to shift the supply curve out. That means the first thing we do is find this new subsidy quantity. We're told that it's 12. At that subsidy quantity, there are two prices. The sellers get a lot more because it's hard for them to increase production. They need to benefit more from the policy than the buyers do. The buyers are price sensitive, so if we just drop their price a little, they'll buy a lot more. We know the difference between these is $20. So reasonable numbers to me seem something like, I don't know, 95 and 115. Seller's price went up a lot more than the buyer's price went down. It looks better if you don't have a slightly slanted line. Analyze the impact of that subsidy to sellers on PQ, CSPS. Okay, so you don't have to use letters if you don't want to. I think they help us. You want to make sure that everything in the big triangle of consumer and producer surplus has a letter. There's a tiny little D there. It's not going to matter very much. And then also everything inside the subsidy payment. So this yellow box is going to be what the government spends because they spend 20 bucks per unit. So 20 times 12. And then G can straddle that line. But it's okay if you did both a G and an H, or if you didn't use any letters at all. So again, we're just going to compare what was happening at the market when we were at 10 solar panels and $100 a pop to what is now happening after the subsidy, when there's 12 people buying them for $95, but sellers are bringing in $115. So at the market, consumers were getting D and A, this tiny little triangle. Producers were getting B and C. The total was A, B, C, D. After the subsidy, buyer's price drops down to $95. How much they like and are willing to pay for solar panels does not change. So they now get D, A, B, D, group B, G, because their price just fell. Their demand didn't move. Producers also have the same costs. We don't base this off of the subsidy supply curve, which is an artificially low willingness to sell because the government's paying them. We base it off of the original purple supply curve. So we jack up their price to $115, but their costs don't change. They now get CBA. But the government is spending money to get us there. So the government is losing money. They're having an outflow. So it subtracts from their total well-being. So consumers are better off, producers are better off, but the government spends A, E, F, E, and G. That subtracts from total well-being. The government is worse off with a subsidy policy. We're gonna add some letters and we'll get to a total of A, B, C, D minus F. That means the deadweight loss, which is the difference in totals, is F. Well-being that we have at the market that we don't have after the subsidy, we have to subtract off F. So the deadweight loss caused by the policy is F. So, my heater is crazy. Explaining a market they'd be likely to subsidize and why. Explaining that they'd subsidize solar panels because this would also reduce the quantity of carbon. The graph and the consequences were 4 points. So if you don't have time, if you're short on time, you just want to make sure that I'm clear that you know what the consequence of the subsidy is. Don't spend a ton of time on the letters because they're only going to be worth a point or not. And I think I actually ended up just adding +1 to everyone that used letters. But for me, they make it more clear what's going on and who's getting it. So yeah, go for it, Justin.
Is C including everything that's like to the right of the purple or like the normal subsidy? Okay. So does that just not matter?
Doesn't matter because that's not actually willingness to sell, right? This is like artificial. This is giving us willingness to sell, what they'd be willing to sell it for. This has been like shifted out by the government. It's not a true reflection of their well-being. The way we show the subsidy impacting their well-being is through their price going up, not through their costs going down, because their costs to make the solar panels don't actually change. They just get paid more for them. Does that kind of make sense? And so that's the real problem, is that these solar panels cost more up here than people value them on their own. And like there's an opportunity cost to the taxpayer dollars we spend getting things we don't value on our own. Now that we understand externalities, we know there was a positive externality here, maybe on the consumption side, where the social demand curve was like up here. So society wanted that subsidy quantity, which is why we implemented the subsidy. And there was another deadweight loss that we've replaced with F that was the same size if we didn't have the subsidy. So we've just swapped out that red deadweight loss for F. The opportunity cost of taxpayer dollars is replacing the fact that the benefits from solar panels to society are greater than the cost to the firms of producing. Tying it back into the new material. So the last thing to answer is this part that was 2 points. If the post-subsidy quantity is 12, how much is the total subsidy payment? Total subsidy payment is always going to be the per unit amount multiplied by the subsidy quantity, which here is $20 times 12, $240. How much of that goes to consumers? The amount that goes to consumers is always what they used to be paying. So P star minus the new price of buyers multiplied by how many people buy the solar panels. So $100 minus 95 times 12 is $60. Like this part is what goes to consumers. B, G, and a tiny piece of that. They get $5 per solar panel and they buy 12 of them, then they get that rectangle. Producers get a lot more of that subsidy payment because it's hard for them to ramp up production. Any other questions on that one? Cool. So then we're supposed to compare the subsidy to the carbon tax. This was worth 8 points. I think 2 of those were for having the similarities. They're both going to decrease the quantity of carbon, which is good. They're both going to cause deadweight loss, even though it's of different types. The differences are that one is going to, the tax is going to harm consumers, harm producers, and help the government. The subsidy is going to help consumers, help producers, but harm the government. So you could say that this tax revenue is going to be spent on solar panel subsidies. That was what some of the Seattle voters thought should happen. The rest thought it should be a revenue neutral tax where it just went back to the taxpayer. So they reduced sales tax in exchange for having a carbon tax. And those 2 groups fought to the point that the tax never got passed. But they serve very similar purposes. They just are going to cost the government money or earn money for the government. But you would, in a lot of countries, see them used at the same time. You use the carbon tax to pay for the subsidy to solar panels. Are they both likely to promote the underlying goals? Yes, if the goal is mostly to reduce climate change. You could say something like the elasticity of supply of the solar panels means there will be a tiny change in quantity. So it might help less, depending on the size of the subsidy. You could also say something like how addicted people are to gas means the tax might not actually do that much for the environment, depending on the size of the tax. That's the kind of thing you could weigh there. Would you vote for either or why? That's your opinion. I voted for the carbon tax many times. Questions about that? What I'm looking for when you weigh things? So the Saturday, Sunday exam was exactly the same, right? In C1 and C2, you had to find an article of one of the 4 policies. The 4 policies are tax, subsidy, price ceiling, price floor. And so the carbon tax is my example of that. The point value was exactly the same as well. The only thing that was different was C3 was different. So does the author of the article seem to understand the pros and cons? Right? That was worth, let's see, 8 points. I think 4 of them were for defending whether the author understands the pros and cons. Something that was really frequent was like the author was advocating for a subsidy, but they didn't really understand that there's a trade-off there. They were kind of treating it like it's free money. A lot of time the author didn't understand that the elasticity would determine who actually pays. Like there was this tax on big companies, and they were saying they should tax them to pay for these social goods, but not assessing the fact that consumers might actually bear the brunt of that if they have really inelastic demand curves. Anything you said to defend that was totally fine. And then, does your economic analysis of the policy change whether you personally support it? So like, do the pros and cons affect your opinion? And that was basically a judgment question, graded a little bit based on effort. So if you didn't put any effort in, if you just said, no, I already understood everything. But you might have lost a half a point for not discussing, commenting on what pieces of your analysis you already knew. I think for me, the first time I learned this, I was in favor of a lot more taxes initially. And then once I realized that consumer surplus might really be the thing that takes the hit, I was a little less likely to support them, but that doesn't happen to everyone. So this was also exactly the same as the last question we just did. It's also all of the a graph of the market. The only thing that was different was it was a $20 subsidy to buyers. So if we're thinking about solar panels again, we'd have our demand and supply and our Q star of 10 and our P star of 100. But then instead of the supply curve shifting right, the demand curve shifts right. We know it won't matter because of golden rule number 1, the subsidy quantity is 12. This price that sellers pay will still be 115 like before. The price that buyers pay will still be 95 like before. Nothing changes as a result of the subsidy. So that one was also 10 points, just like it was on the other exam. Explaining the market they'd be likely to subsidize, and that was 2. This was 4. And this last part was 4. If the post-subsidy quantity is 12, calculate the amount of deadweight loss. So this is the deadweight loss. Its area is 1/2 times the base of 12 minus 10 times the height of $20, the amount of the subsidy. So 1/2 times 2 times 20 is 20. That's calculating the amount. Boom. What does that deadweight loss represent intuitively? So this was 1 for calculating the amount, 1 for the deadweight loss intuition, which is the opportunity cost of taxpayer dollars, however you like to say it. The fact that those solar panels they get cost more to produce than people value, and you have to spend good money to get them to us. How a journalist opposed to the policy might attempt to document the deadweight loss was 2 points. So talking about how you document it. I think I would go out and take a picture of underfunded schools, or people that are doing wind farms but not equipped for solar and aren't getting the same subsidies. Anything that captures the opportunity cost could have been done with those taxpayer dollars would be a good explanation of what the subsidy is costing society. And that's the answer key to exam 2. So anything you want me to go back to, or sorry, exam 1, anything you want to think about with that one? Can you folks see my feedback on Moodle? Because I write all these extensive comments, and then I had a couple students tell me they couldn't see them. They couldn't find where to look at them.
On like the problem sets and exams?
On the exam specifically.
I believe I can double check. I think I definitely got them on the first exam.
Okay, that would be helpful if you double checked in the background. Just want to make sure everyone can see this. Okay, so this is exam 2, more fresh in our brains, right? For this one, behavioral and information economics. There were not 2 versions of this exam. I got lazy. Doesn't mean there won't be 2 versions of the final. Explain how the results of the Stanford marshmallow experiment relate to time inconsistency was 6 points. So the results are that children who wait longer do better in life. Better as defined by the authors. They are more successful later on. They earn more money, they score better on tests. Like basically how patient you are as a kid is a good predictor. A lot of people just said like they described what happened in the video, but they didn't really talk about the results of the study. Like the results of the study, what they were trying to study was how does your relationship to time inconsistency and procrastination, temptation relate to what happens to you later on. And so their results were that people who waited longer were more successful. So I was asking, how do those relate to time inconsistency, but also whether you think that generalizes. So it was 2 for your discussing the results and also your opinion. Like, I think this experiment is BS. I don't know. Marshmallows are not the same thing as success. This was a lab experiment. Maybe you think that, yeah, they do generalize. People who can not get distracted by their phone do better on exams, do better in relationships, something like that. And then because a lot of people didn't really understand what I was looking for this one, I kind of reallocated the points and made it so like 2 of them were for talking about what the future-oriented self is and what it wanted in this experiment, which was to wait for the second marshmallow. 2 of them were for talking about what the present-oriented self is and what it wanted was to eat the first one in the moment. And kind of putting that together into an explanation of what time inconsistency is. So most people just lost like half a point here because they didn't really talk about the results of the experiment at all or whether they generalized. Thanks, Jesse. So if you are having trouble, this is for the benefit of people watching this later. If you're wondering where my comments are, when you're in Moodle, you need to click review exam to see all the comments that I make. But question by question, I tell you where you lost points. So the next one, B, was 4 points. One instance where you forgot that money is fungible. People have lots of great examples for this one. A lot of them were like forgetting that money that's in your Venmo balance is actual money. So then you don't spend it. And that's actually helpful because you spend less money. A lot of them were like, you have coins in a jar and you forget that they're actually money. So you spend less money again. Some people talked about spending more when you have small bills than you would if you had giant bills. I wrote a lot of notes that don't make sense anymore, like gold change, envelopes, Lego set, selling an ATV. Some people talked about their family gambles with toothpicks, and that makes it feel like it's not real money. So then they actually are more risky, and that's harmful. So it's just remembering that forgetting that money is flexible and can be in different forms can actually be helpful or harmful. So I think only a few people lost points because I didn't feel like their example was actually about fungibility at all. It was just about like, whether you should spend money or not. C was worth 7 points. So again, the way I grade creativity is usually if you have one that we've done before, like a few people talked about selling a car, but that's one that I directly discussed in the videos and that we talked about in class as well. You might have lost a point there. Otherwise, you just lost points if you had the same example as multiple people. People talked about things like drug deals, chewing tobacco and its harmful side effects, buying souvenirs in Paris, Enron, MBA contracts, buying a puppy online, lots of different things that were great examples. One thing, so the way that I allocated those 7 points for C was 3 of them were for the creativity, 2 were for the moral hazard piece, and 2 were for the adverse selection piece. So it says, describe how the situation leads to adverse selection and moral hazard. So if you had a situation that only led to one of them and you explained why it didn't lead to the other, that would be totally fine. But if you just ignored the other one, I was looking for you to do something like the presidential election where there is moral hazard afterwards and adverse selection ahead of time. So I wanted you to pick something that had both. D was worth 5 points, 1 per example. And hopefully you understand in my comments if I felt like you didn't distinguish well between regulation and screening, for example, or statistical discrimination is generalizing about a group based on averages for the group and not the individual. So a lot of people said statistical discrimination would be looking at this person's health records and charging them a different premium, but that is not statistical discrimination. That's more like screening because it's about the specific individual. Statistical discrimination is always looking at the average health problems for people in that age group and charging them a different rate. It's not based on the individual. E, let's talk about E. So E, I think, was the most challenging, the stretch question at the end, so it was only worth 2 points. So using real world examples, explain why dead weight loss changes after asymmetric information is revealed. You know I can't talk about things without using graph, but you did not have to. So remember in the video I talked about like the problem with lemons is that because you can't prove your car is good, everyone else is going to assume your car is terrible, and that's going to make their demand really low. So if you can fix that by being able to perfectly reveal the quality of your car, that's going to make people willing to pay more because they're not suspicious about the quality anymore. There's going to be a lot of bad cars that drop out of the market because we can tell that they're crappy. But now this is going to be the market for the quality cars, and that market is going to grow. And so all of this right here is going to be dead weight loss if we have imperfect information. The shrunken yellow market that results because we can't perfectly explain, perfectly prove the quality of our goods is the causing that to be dead weight loss. So if the market grows, when we resolve that, then all of that is dead weight loss. But none of that is intuitive really or helpful. But the idea would be, let's say this is like the market for babysitters. If you can prove that you're a good babysitter, you're going to be able to earn, babysitters will earn a higher wage. They can be perfectly monitored and you know that they're doing a great job of watching the kids. This is going to draw in all of these high quality babysitters that before it wasn't worth their time or energy. And all of these, so that's like the new sellers that come in right here. And all of these consumers who weren't in the market before because they were wary of the quality of the good. So you have all of these parents who can now go out to dinner. You have all of these babysitters who can now switch to a job they actually enjoy instead of, I don't know, working, bagging groceries. So that would be the type of real worldness I was looking for. So I might have lost like a half a point if you didn't have any like tangible real world applications. But as long as you got that the market grows, typically, a lot of people said that weight loss would go up because once you can see the car is crap, you won't want to buy it. But that's ignoring the primary effect, which is that it draws higher quality workers, higher quality product into the market because they can prove its quality. And then F was extra credit if you had time to do some math. Okay. Any questions about 1, Jesse or Jane? Number 2 was about cost, 24 points. The first one was worth 3 points. It doesn't say show your work, but you should show your work if you want to get partial credit in case you get it wrong. The profit that the accountant will measure is the $150,000 in revenue minus the explicit cost. So an explicit cost is the $50,000 she spends on supplies, right? Supplies are a variable cost. And then the $10,000 in rent, a fixed cost. And the $15,000 on labor, another variable cost. Probably. Good night, Mom. Good night, buddy. I love you. I'll come check on you later. So that is a total explicit cost of $75,000. So she's making $75,000. An accountant will not tell her to compare that to what she was making before. We always just want to compare accounting and economic profit to 0. That's greater than 0, so they say, boom, you're good to go. The economist is going to think about the implicit cost, what she could have been making. So the economist will start with accounting profit and then subtract off her implicit cost that she could have been making $20,000 a year. That's an opportunity cost. And then the interest she could have earned on her savings, that $5,000 in interest, that $20,000 salary, and they'll say, actually, you're only making $50,000, which is still greater than 0, so you're still good to go. A lot of people compared those two numbers to her salary before plus her savings before with interest. And then some people even assumed that she could have earned interest on this stuff too, which was kind of outside the problem, but maybe she could have, maybe it's a loan. And that is really double counting those costs, right? So it's allowing that $50,000 on supplies and the $50,000 that could be in savings to both lower her profit and both count as a cost. So you want to be careful to just compare them to 0. So they would give you the same advice because they're both greater than 0. Does that make sense? So then B, you were choosing a industry where you'd like to work. Lots of great ones, lots of finance, commercial real estate, outdoor trip leading, software development, Ben & Jerry's, dentist, vet, surgeon, sports marketing, garage door company, sugar, lawyer, great stuff. And then 2 sources of fixed costs and 2 sources of variable cost. B was worth 4 points. 2 each for each of the 2 types of costs. C, specific to this industry, explain which of the short run cost curves are U-shaped in the short run and why. So C is one that a lot of people lost points. It was worth 4 points. So for C, we want to talk about the U. In the short run, when one input is fixed, the cost curves go up because diminishing marginal product, usually of labor, when you have a fixed input in the short run. So specifically, let's say I want to work at an ice cream shop when I leave Colby. The ice cream stand is going to only be a certain size. That's too many cooks in the kitchen, physical constraints, but it's also you run out of jobs. And in the beginning, your costs are going down because you're going to specialize in one job at a time. I'm sorry, when you have multiple workers, they can each have their own place on the assembly line. Quantity is going up really quickly here, which is dragging our per unit cost down. Here, quantity is either falling or not going up as rapidly, so it's pushing our per unit cost up. And so it's all of our per unit cost that are about adding variable inputs that can be changed. So these 3 are the ones that are U-shaped. I think one of those 4 points was for saying that. One of the 4 points was for telling me the story about specialization. One was for telling me the story about diminishing marginal product of labor, and one was about being specific to your industry. So a lot of people forgot to say specific to my industry. So like if I'm going to be a lawyer after I graduate, it's not about too many cooks physically in the kitchen. Might be about initially as you're hiring lots of lawyers, they're very productive because they each find their niche of the law that they like doing. And so if your office is a fixed size, or more realistically, if you have kind of a fixed set of norms and a fixed way of billing, they each fit into that and are more productive at the beginning, but they eventually become less and less productive because within that fixed way of billing, the fixed norms of the office, you run out of niches for new lawyers. So the last lawyers you hire are much more expensive per unit to bring in the same amount of clients. They have to spend a bunch more on advertising to bring in the same number of cases. They have to spend a bunch more on paralegals to bring in the same amount of productive cases because of diminishing marginal returns. So you should like push yourself to tell a story specific to your industry. So that's how those 4 points were divvied up. Any questions about that? I feel like that was one that was tricky for people, especially was the difference between C and E. So you want to be really clear on like, what do we mean by the short run? The short run is when something is fixed. The long run is when everything is flexible. In our classroom factory, the thing that was fixed was we only had one stapler and you only had so much space on the stage in Ostrov or on the table in 141. But then the long run is when you're deciding how big do we want to be? Do we want to be an international firm? Do we want to be statewide? Do we want to still just sell in our town? And what's good and bad about being big is part E. Okay. So D was 4 points. The difference between the short run and the long run. In the short run, at least one input is fixed. In the long run, all inputs can be changed. You can buy as many staplers as you want. You can have as many taco trucks as you want. And that means all fixed costs are variable costs. So it's like 1 point for understanding each of those pieces of the definition of things, kind of the foundation. And then I think the tough part is the specifics. So we talked on the practice exam, a question really similar to this was like, for Colby, what determines their long run versus short run? I was saying the thing that's most fixed at Colby is the tenured faculty or the real estate of the campus. So the long run is when they can find a buyer for all of this real estate or get out of all of those contracts. So long run is very long for a university. For the ice cream shop, probably the thing that's fixed is their lease. So the long run is when they can get out of the lease on their storefront. That's probably not very long for them. So thinking about for your industry, what takes the longest to change? That makes sense. A lot of people were just like long run, short run. Long run is when you can enter or exit in perfect competition. And that's true, right? All inputs can be changed. That's related to entry or exit. But that's really a thing about perfect competition. Right? We talked about the long run for monopolistic competition is about imitation. But in some ways, you want to kind of push yourself to like live in the world of the problem. And when we talked about long run and short run for cost, it was all about, can I change as much as I want, which is related to these things. But it was really about an input being fixed. Can I change the factory? Can I change the norms, all of that stuff? So E was also worth 4 points. And E is about the long run ATC curve. So the long run ATC curve is also U-shaped, but this is about bigger is cheaper, so economies of scale, why a bigger firm would have lower cost. And that should be something about buying in bulk, learning by doing, which is like opening your 5th taco truck is cheaper than your 4th because you made a bunch of mistakes in the way you laid out the truck last time that you don't make this time. It's power over suppliers. You can force firms to sell you their product at cost if you're big enough. And then eventually you run into diseconomies of scale where bigger gets more expensive. And it's not about too many cooks in the kitchen. It's not about decreased productivity. So lots of people lost points because the story they were telling for E was the same as the story they were telling for C. We're talking about diminishing marginal product of labor. The long run is not about diminishing marginal product of labor. It's about once you're big enough, you pay a bunch more taxes. You have to provide healthcare. You are in 5 different time zones and you have to work with people in different currencies. Everyone's paying a lot of attention to the way you treat your workers, so you have to treat them better. All of that stuff. It's not about people becoming less productive. That makes sense? So the learning by doing story is not about specializing or diminishing marginal productivity. It's just, it's cheaper to open the 10th branch than the 9th one because you made a lot of mistakes the first 9 times and you learned from them. But it's not about productivity. So I think that's an important question. If you feel confused about, feel free to ask questions because lots of people lost quite a few points. So this one's super fun. First thing we can do, fill in fixed cost. They don't change. They're 400 all the way down. It's not average fixed cost divided by quantity fixed cost. So we know variable cost is 0 if we don't produce anything. That means I can say that total cost is 400 here. Can't calculate the other two because I'd be dividing by 0. If I know total cost is 700, variable cost is going to be 300, right? Because total cost is fixed cost plus variable cost. That's one way I can calculate it. Marginal cost is always going to be the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. So total cost went up by 300 here. Quantity went up by 1, so it's 300. Average total cost is always going to be total cost divided by quantity. So 700 divided by 1, 700. At a quantity of 2, the only thing I know is marginal cost is 100. That means the difference between these must be 100. So this one must be 800. This one must be 400 because variable cost is always total cost minus fixed cost. This one must be 800 divided by 2, 400. Now, the only thing I'm told at a quantity of 3 is that average total cost is 245. If average total cost is total cost divided by quantity, that means that total cost is average total cost multiplied by quantity. So I do 245 times 3, I get 735. It means marginal cost is negative 65. A lot of people lost a half a point for dropping the negative and not showing their work, but that's a minor thing. Variable cost is going to be total cost minus fixed cost, 335. Then we know total cost again. So I can tell that this is 650, 1050 minus 400. I can tell that this is 1050 minus 735, 315. I can tell that this is 1050 divided by 4, 262. If you spent a lot of time on this question, jumped. It was worth 5 points. Each column was a point. If you made a mistake in a column, you might have lost half a point. If you didn't show your work, you might have lost more than that. But if you just wrote out the formulas and did nothing else on this problem because it was taking you way too long, you would have gotten at least half the points. So don't murder yourself spending lots and lots of time on a problem that is maybe your brain doesn't work that way. It doesn't like go from knowing the formulas to being able to fill in the chart really quickly. Go back and do it if you have time. Just write out the formulas so I know you learned something about how to calculate. Questions about that? Perfect competition. This one was 24 points. Choose a market that's close to perfectly competitive. Like hopefully going into the final, you have like a market in your back pocket that you thought about a lot. Perfect competition, one that's monopoly, one that's monopolistic competition, one that's oligopoly. People had a lot of great ideas here. Couple people did things, like a lot of people did porn. A lot of people did porn. So I took off a point there for originality. A lot of people did things that we had talked about briefly in the video, and I taken off like half a point. People did things like water bottles at Yankee Stadium, bed sheets, bananas, blueberries. pencils, crayfish farming, toilet paper, shampoo, dry cleaners, clementines, bath bombs, light bulbs, water bottles, potatoes. Anything like that is fine. Let's do the crayfish farming. That sounds fun. Important market. I think I might be spelling crayfish wrong. You can say it lots of different ways. So 3 of those 24 points refer to originality. 4 points are for explaining whether you believe sellers will be price takers and why. So for crayfish farm, actually I can't do crayfish farm because I'm going to say it the wrong way the whole time. Let's help us out with the practice exam and do the market for minimum wage labor. Explain whether you believe sellers in this market will act as price takers and why. This should be something that's about the fact that the product is semi-identical. They don't have as many unique skills that would give them bargaining power. There's no barriers to getting in and out. So people are always going to undercut them if they try and charge more than minimum wage for their labor. All these competitors around, and all of that means that they can only sell at the equilibrium price. If they try charging more, people will just go to a substitute. If they try charging less, they just make less money. And then you should have been specific. So 2 of the points were for talking about why they can only charge P star. You might have gotten those points if you talked about kind of the mechanics of what happens if you charge a little less or charge a little more. Or if we're talking about the identical product, the no barriers to entry and all the competitors. And then 2 of the points were for the specific. Do you think minimum wage workers act as price takers? I think that they largely do, although I think with seniority, you can pressure the firm to raise your wage. Or if you have some unique skills that make you not an identical product, which is a bad way to talk about humans, you could definitely pressure them to pay you more than the same that everyone else is getting paid, which is like $11 a name right now. B was also 4 points. How sellers in this market choose how much to produce. They compare the price, which is their marginal revenue, to their marginal cost. So they follow their golden rule and they produce only here, because if they go beyond here, every unit costs more than it brings in. So it's not going to earn them any profit. It's going to lose them money. So all of these units here are profitable. All of these ones here are not. For a minimum wage worker, intuitively, that's because there's an increasing opportunity cost to their time. All of these hours they spend after this amount of hours are going to cost them more in time with their family and time and leisure than they bring in wage. So they're not worth it. See, this was one where there were, I think, just a lot of misunderstandings, which maybe that's my bad, but this one was worth 10 points. So starting from long run equilibrium, use a graph to show the short run impact of an increase in individual cost that does not change supply in the larger market. So for me, this would be like the example we had in the practice exam, where the individual seller goes back to school. So let's say that like the individual worker has another kid. That's going to make the opportunity cost of their time increase, maybe. It's going to make it harder to work for at least a while. Not going to change supply in the larger market because it's not a huge scale event. Something that would make their costs go up and be big enough to shift supply in the larger market was if there were a law that every worker had to provide their own health care. That would both increase their costs of working and shift the supply curve to the left. So when I wrote this problem, I thought it was a very straightforward application because I had told you there were 6 different potential shifts. I am aware that that's not the way you experienced it. but I want to show you why I thought it was really straightforward. So when we did perfect competition in chapter 13, I talked you through how in the shifts graph in class, we talked about how there are 6 potential shifts. And I showed you where to find them, right? The first category of shifts are things that can change the demand curve, demand going up or down. The second category is things that change supply, but not changing costs, because we only want to shift one thing at a time to keep our lives simple. So I think the example on the problem set was something like an earthquake in one part of the world that doesn't affect your seller. Or you could have the global supply go up, but not the individual's cost. That was the example we did together in class. Or you could have a change in cost that doesn't change global supply. So to me, I did the opposite of the exam in the optional video. I had this question mark here. I thought it was a very leading question. I was like, if there's one thing you haven't seen, where could that show up? And then that's not what you experience. So I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to be tricky in any way with that problem. So the event that makes their costs go up but does not change supply in the larger market is they have another kit. Before we draw that, we want to show where they started. So we always have our 2 panels when we do this graph. We have the larger market with supply and demand for workers that sets the number, equilibrium amount of minimum wage jobs in Maine, let's say, and the equilibrium price, which in this market is a wage. They take that price as given. It becomes their marginal revenue curve and their demand curve. We have their marginal cost, which tells the individual how much to work, like we said last time. And we start from a place where they're not making any money because there's no barriers to entry. If they were making money in these jobs, people would enter. And then their costs go up. So they have another kid. So this problem was worth 2 points or 10 points. 2 of those points were for having the global graph, both the baseline and then any changes, and then the words that go along with what's happening in the global graph. 2 of those points were for having the individual graph, the baseline individual graph and any changes, and the words that go along with it. So it was like 6 points for the graph, 2 for the event, filling in this event here, and then 2 for having a change in cost that would match the event. So if you describe something that would increase their variable cost, then you should shift their marginal cost up and their ATC curve up. If you describe something that would increase their fixed cost, you just increase their average total cost curve. It doesn't make each hour of working add more to their cost. It just makes the average of their costs go up. So I think having a kid makes each hour you spend working more expensive. Right? You're missing out on stuff. You now also have to pay for more daycare to spend that time working. Anytime we shift marginal, we have to shift average total, but the opposite is not true. So we have a new higher, because this is just dollars per unit, they can just be physically higher up on the y-axis. The first thing is to find MC equal to MR. This person is going to work less after they have this increase in costs, and they're going to lose money. So at that new quantity, their profit is this green box, and it's negative. So they lose money. And that is what you needed to do for C. In D, you talk about the long run. So usually in the long run, if somebody is making negative profit, so this long run piece was worth 3 points. If you said because people are losing money, people will exit and supply will go here, and then the price goes back and everything's back to zero profit. You got most of those points. But remember that this individual is a tiny drop in the bucket. In reality, one minimum wage worker having a kid is not going to cause mass exodus from the market. All it means is this person in the right-hand panel is not a representative worker anymore. They're losing money. In the long run, they will probably exit, right? Or they're going to have their opportunity cost of their time go back down. Maybe once they stop breastfeeding or something like that, their time away from their kid doesn't mean as much to them. So they're either going to exit or their costs will fall and they'll make zero profit again. But they might, because their implicit cost, their opportunity cost is above what they're bringing in, switch to a different industry. Maybe one that is more flexible, gives them more time with their kid. Maybe they go down to part-time, but they will leave because they're making no money. That will have zero impact over here. If anything, it would do like this, shift the supply curve like a tiny bit, but it should have no impact over there. So I had a lot of emails during the exam, like, you said something that won't change supply in the larger market. It's like, yeah, that's fine. If it doesn't change anything in the larger market, then write that. I wasn't trying to trick you. I was trying to get you to think about, is something that affects one person enough to bring us back to the zero profit equilibrium? Or does this now non-representative person who's losing money as a worker in this industry just leave, right? Like what has happened during the pandemic, all of these moms dropping out of the labor market because now their childcare costs are higher, the opportunity cost of their time is higher because their kids are homeschooled. They leave the labor market and hopefully they come back, but not so far. Right? But that is not enough to cause mass exit in a way that makes wages go back up and bring it into equilibrium, because it happened to one person in our example. Does that make sense? Okay. So in the long run in Part D, their profit is negative. So the individual is going to exit if that change in their cost is permanent. But because they're just a tiny drop in a giant ocean, there's going to be minimal impact on the larger one. But if you did the thing where you're like, Professor Meredith said the long run always goes back to zero profit, and you showed that, you got 2 out of the 3 points. We can talk about the extra credit. Show and explain the short run and long run consequences of an event. In the larger market this time, it causes individual sellers to have ATC greater than ABC greater than price. So this is the oh crap scenario where your price drops down so far. Could be because demand goes way down, like maybe there's a pandemic and the demand for minimum wage labor makes the price be way down here. Your cost curves aren't moving around. So you've got this ATC that's here, this ABC that's here, and your price is below both of them. So what the individual will want to do in the short run, they'll want to work less. Even though they're working less, they're going to have this huge negative profit rectangle. Their ATC is here, their ABC is here, and their price is down here. So in the long run, they're going to exit, and lots of people are going to exit because this is something that made everyone's wages fall, not just one individual having a kid. This is a pandemic. As people exit, they have to exit enough that the price goes back to where it started, and we return to this zero profit equilibrium. Now, this individual might be one of the ones that sticks around and waits for their price to go back to where it started, or they might be one of the ones who exits in the short run or in the long run. But for the average person left in the market in the long run, things go back to where they started. Okay, monopoly, last question. Hopefully you started here if you were following your truth, meaning point values. Choose a firm with monopoly power due to economies of scale on the supply side. So that means bigger is cheaper. The extreme of that is a natural monopoly, but you didn't have to be that extreme. Lots of people did Amtrak or another like railroad company. Might have lost a little bit of points there because I did talk about Amtrak in the video. but not much. A lot of people did waste management. Quite a few people did waste management. Different utility companies. A lot of people did Luxottica eyeglasses. Whichever you choose, the points in 3 were about a few things. So it was 3 points for part A. Sorry. Choose a firm, explain how it's different from a network good. So A was about explaining that economies of scale on the supply side means bigger is cheaper. It means that your average total costs go down as you produce more. You probably have really large fixed costs and really low marginal costs, like a ski resort, or you have a lot of learning by doing, power over suppliers, buying in bulk. So it was 1 point for explaining that, 1 point for picking a firm that would match that, and 1 point for saying this is not a network good because it's not about increased benefits as you increase your consumers. So Walmart is not a network good because we're not all better off. The more customers shop at Walmart, it's not like the store gets better the more people are in there or the more of our data they have, realistically. B was, where do we draw the long run ATC curve for a monopolist? That was 3 points. And B was about, we assume that the monopolist in the long run has profit greater than 0. So we draw an ATC that is less than their price, right? We draw demand, marginal revenue, marginal cost, and we know we can draw their ATC curve anywhere in here. Its minimum is on marginal cost, but it doesn't have to be anywhere else. Some people said some stuff about how it like has to be specifically at this purple point, but it could actually be way the heck down here, as long as it's below price. It doesn't matter where it is relative to quantity, where it is relative to marginal cost, except that it's on its minimum. It just has to be below price, meaning that profit is possible. So that was 3 points. It's U-shaped, its minimum is on marginal cost, but I think I ended up giving those points primarily just for saying that it has to be below price. C was 4 points. How would a journalist document some real world deadweight loss from a monopolist deadweight loss? So a lot of people talked about utility companies. Deadweight loss could be coming from the pain for consumers or locking out competitors, but you want to have some real world specifics of what that would look like for your industry. So if you're thinking about like a waste management company, the pain for consumers is either like our price is so high because they're the only place in town, but I have no choices. Or it's like their customer service is so terrible because nobody's competing with them and they have this government sanctioned monopoly. Or it could be there's all these other firms that have been killed off by Walmart in my town and I'm taking pictures of them. Whatever you think of as being the source of the deadweight loss and how you document that specifically. D, do a news search, describe a recent event, cite the article. So that was 2 points for finding the article. I think pretty much everybody got those points. It can be anything, changing demand or cost. And then draw a new long run equilibrium graph. Use the graph to explain how you predict it would change things. So that was 4 points for E. One of those was for having the baseline monopoly graph. So you've got your demand, marginal revenue, marginal cost, your ATC at that quantity. They are making a profit. Equal to the red box. And then you shift things around. Like, let's say this is a waste management company. And then COVID hits and all of a sudden we're all eating out of plastic, and you think the primary effect was that it made their demand go up, then they're going to produce more, they're going to charge more, and they're going to make more profit. Swallows it up. A couple of common misconceptions with the graph. So one of the points was for having a baseline. One of the points was for having a shift. The other 2 points were for talking about how this will change price, right? But like price goes up, quantity goes up, profit goes up, dead weight loss here goes from being the green rectangle that's kind of hard to see to being the orange rectangle that's kind of hard to see. So it looks like dead weight loss goes up. Intuitively, that's because when demand is higher, there's going to be more potential mutually beneficial transactions, and the monopolist is going to chop off more good stuff that could have happened. They're going to like rip off more customers, charge more, and it shrinks the market more than perfect competition would have, because perfect competition would end up way out here. But as long as what like the article you chose matched what you drew and you had some consequences somewhere, you got those points. Common misconception is like people seem to be drawing the profit for the monopolist kind of here. The profit for monopolist is always the price that they charge minus the average total cost times the quantity. Which average total cost? It's where the ATC crosses the current quantity they're producing, right? The average total cost per job on any graph is if I plug a quantity in, this is the ATC at this quantity. If my quantity grows, I need to plug that new quantity into the ATC and I'll get a different ATC. So you want to make sure that you're plugging in the current quantity to the ATC curve when you draw the bottom of the profit rectangle. I know this looks nonsensical and impossible to see what's happening. I'm happy to do that slower later on. F was 3 points. Do you think Tirol would be in favor of the recent antitrust lawsuit against Google? Why or why not? Lots of good things you could say there. 1 point for having an opinion, 2 points for defending it. Might have lost a point if you had incredibly low effort. Like if you said, I think Tirol would be super in favor because Google is a network good and he loves network goods. You need to prove to me when you have an essay type of question like that, all right, a huge long essay like you would in some other classes, but just that you have considered multiple points from the article. So in the interview, Tirol talks about like maybe he would be for it because competition in tech isn't real competition. Most of the firms competing with Google are just competing with them so they can get bought out by Google. So that's not actual competition. So maybe this lawsuit would encourage actual competition. Maybe he would be against it because he doesn't think they're actually harming consumers. He views them as being a network good that's better the more people use it, and they don't even charge a price. But you should kind of weigh the two arguments he makes and not just pick one sentence from the article and roll with it. That might make me think you haven't actually read it or like considered all the pros and cons to it. Give examples of how the monopolist in part A might use segmenting by time and versioning. So G was worth 4 points. 2 of those were for segmenting by time, and 2 of those were for versioning. Segmenting by time is where they know ahead of time that people are cheap at a certain time. So this is like the Black Friday story where all of the prices are lower because they know people on Black Friday are really price sensitive. This could be like charging more for a book right the day that it's released. Because you know the people that rush out to buy it are the ones that care the most about it. And then you have things be on sale later on. Like most sales are segmenting by time, charging less for the good later on when you know the people that might buy it are pretty price sensitive and don't care enough about it to buy it when it's first released. So segmenting by time is charging different groups different prices based on the time they choose to buy the good. So a lot of people did like electricity companies or utilities. They could charge more for electricity in the summer in a hot place because they know your demand is inelastic and you need to cool off. They could charge more for electricity in a cold place in the winter because they know you need to heat up. They could charge more for garbage removal in the summer because they know your garbage is stinkier and you need it out of your life, right? Like stuff like that. Charging more at a different time of year or time relative to release. I know your group ahead of time because I know when you're price sensitive and I charge different prices based on time. Versioning is like having the deluxe versus the standard and then a million other options with different add-ons and perks and bells and whistles. Anytime you can't tell people apart, so you just make a bunch of different products that are slightly different to get them to reveal themselves and what attributes they care about and how much they're willing to pay for different attributes, that's versioning. It's different because you can't tell the customers apart. Extra credit, explain 2 events that would make the monopolist not be able to price discriminate. That's things like arbitrage, people you give the discount to, flip it around. They're like, hey, I got this sweet discount. I'll give it to you for like a little bit more than they charged me. Or it could be they don't have any market power. They can't charge a different price because they have to just charge P-star. Maybe the government outlaws it, something like that. And then use a graph to show how that would affect consumer and producer surplus. So if you have this demand curve and this supply curve, if you charge everyone the same price, let's say we're here, but if you could offer a discount to seniors and a premium to business people, then you would have 3 different prices. This would be your new producer surplus that you would earn. This would be your new producer surplus you'd take away from consumers. So consumer surplus will go up if you're only at the yellow one, maybe, because you have all these new seniors. So this is new consumer surplus if you can price discriminate. But this is lost consumer surplus if you can price discriminate. It would depend which is bigger. A lot of times consumers are better off when you can price discriminate because you bring in these new cheap consumers into the market. But there are some people, those business people that are now paying along because you can tell they're price insensitive, that are going to lose because of this. Producer surplus definitely goes up, right? There's more transactions that benefit the producers, and deadweight loss usually goes down because there's more mutually beneficial transactions. None of this stuff over here would have happened if there were not a new lower price. That was the exam. Do you have any questions, Jamie or Jesse, that I didn't answer?
I don't have any other questions on this exam, but just out of curiosity, should we, I don't know if you can answer this, but should we expect any of the articles that we've read this semester to be included in the exam?
The Tirol interview, and does studying economics make you less cooperative?
Okay,
Those were the only 2, right?
I think so.
So I'd say those 2 are fair game. I wouldn't expect specifics from either of the articles. So if you have reasonable notes from both of them, you should be pretty fine.
Okay.
Good question. So let's talk about the exam. I'm happy to also, I was talking to Jamie ahead of time about the practice exam. Do you have any specific questions about the practice exam? The one you're getting ready to do in your group?
No.
Okay, we felt good about that one. I'm happy to answer specific questions about that or do examples of anything you want to see, or just say good night, whatever feels good. I know it's like kind of weird to review for an exam that's not for like a week, 2 weeks. Is there any of this exam one material you feel like it would be good to see another example of, or like see how it relates to stuff?
I'm just opening up. I know I had one question, but I'll find it. It might take me a second.
One thing that I love to do on the exam is put a government policy into one of the graphs where you haven't seen it before, like into the monopoly graph or the perfect competition graph. So you see that on the practice exam where I put a minimum wage into a perfect competition. So I'd be happy to do like, think about what a tax would look like or a subsidy would look like in perfect competition or something that might be helpful. That would be a way of working in government policy and perfect competition, which are two things that people typically struggle with. Could even work it into an externality problem or something like that. But I also wouldn't judge either of you if you just left. Or we could solve game theory games until our eyes bleed. Any thoughts on whether you'd rather, if you're going to stick around, if you'd rather see me do one that was like government policy into perfect competition and then think about externality, or just do some game theory, how to solve cash equilibria, dominant strategies.
I think I would prefer one, but it doesn't. I'll go with whatever.
Jamie, do you have any preferences? If you think of your question, feel free to interject. Okay, so let's do a question where it was like, show and explain the impact of the corn subsidy paid to sellers in the short run, B was the long run, and C was discuss how the deadweight loss from the subsidy might be justified or worsened depending on the carbon footprint of corn. So corn is a perfectly competitive market, right? All corn cobs look pretty much the same. It's relatively easy to grow, also easy to plow your cornfield under and plant something else, so pretty easy to leave and easy to get in. And many, many people around the world grow corn, many, many people around the world eat corn. So we've got the global market over here on the left and the individual market on the right. Jamie's going to travel past plenty of cornfields they go home. We are going to be remembering corn as we celebrate Thanksgiving, because without the intervention of Indigenous peoples, nobody would be able to live in America. But we've got the global quantity and price. We've got dollars per unit here and the individual quantity. Sure. So before thinking about this question, let's think about the income and substitution effects real quick. That's a great question. So going back to the first exam, I asked about them a lot. So when daycare prices go up, what will happen to the quantity of diapers? Two effects are going to impact it. The first one is the income effect. Because the price of the good went up, you're going to feel poor, right? One of the goods that you spend half your money on or a big chunk of your money on just became more expensive. So that might make the quantity of diapers go down. You might buy less, you might cut corners on diapers because you're spending a lot more on daycare to get the same amount of care. The substitution effect is the fact that diapers feel cheap compared to daycare. So the other good got more expensive, then the good that stayed the same is going to feel cheap relative to the other good. Diapers are already really cheap compared to daycare, and they're not very close substitutes. So things where they're not close substitutes, the substitution effect is not going to be very powerful. It's not like you think, should I take my kid to daycare or should I wrap them in 20 diapers? Same thing, right? They're going to be equally happy either way. Like if they were close substitutes, then daycare getting more expensive might make you buy a lot more diapers. The idea here is you might buy more because diapers feel so much cheaper than daycare. I don't think this is going to be a big deal with diapers and daycare because they're not very close substitutes, right? So I think what's more likely to dominate is this one. So you start cutting corners on diapers. You're like, I'm spending so much for daycare, y'all better provide diapers, something like that. But it's always like, it doesn't matter what the goods are. The income effect is always the idea that if the price goes up, you'll feel poor and buy less of the other good that wasn't affected by the price change. But also that other good will feel cheap. So let's say instead this were like the price of Dr. Pepper. And the two goods I spend my money on are Dr. Pepper and coffee. So it's like if Dr. Pepper becomes more expensive, what will happen to the amount of coffee I buy? The income effect here, let's say that Dr. Pepper gets cheaper. So now I'm going to feel rich. I might buy more coffee just because I have so much more money in my pocket because one of the goods I spend all my money on got cheap. But coffee is going to feel expensive relative to Dr. Pepper. So I might buy less. I'd say for me, the substitution effect is going to be more likely to dominate because the two goods are just a means to an end of caffeine. So I'm not going to feel rich just because Dr. Pepper is on sale, but I might feel like coffee is really expensive and buy less of it. Does that make sense? But that's because the two goods are closer substitutes than diaper and daycare. Does that make sense, Jesse? So I'd say when the goods are both necessities or when they're unrelated, income effect is more likely to dominate. If they're close substitutes, then the substitution effect is more likely to dominate, but the effects are always the same. It's like the relative price change for the substitution effect and the feeling of your income going up or down, even though it hasn't actually changed, just that one good is eating up more or less of it. Good question. So that was the question on the Thursday-Friday exam. The question on the Saturday-Sunday exam was if her daycare gets more expensive. So it started at like 102,000 or whatever. And then daycare got more expensive, so she could only afford 50 of it. That's the rotation. She might have been, if she was being efficient with her money, she was somewhere on the budget constraint like this. So if the income effect dominates and after the rotation, she's going to buy less diapers than she was before, right? This is the quantity of diapers she was buying before. Then she's going to move somewhere like this afterwards. That would be the quantity of diapers falling. And that's if the income effect was dominant. If the substitution effect dominates and she's going to buy more diapers because daycare is expensive, it would be like moving there. So in order to use the graph of the budget constraint to show, you just had to like show where she started and that we don't know where she'll end up, right? That like after her budget constraint rotates, she could be at one of those 2 points, or she could like have the same exact amount of diapers and just have a lot less daycare because diapers are such a necessity. So let's finish this question. Be done. So we've got corn, perfectly competitive market. Demand for corn maybe slightly more elastic than the supply because like once the corn is planted, it's hard for you to change how much of it you're going to bring to market. And it is perishable, right? You can store it in ways, but it will expire and rot. Hard to adjust, but not as hard as like coffee or vineyards to adjust how much you supply. Demand side, for people that make ethanol, there are no substitutes, but there are substitutes for all the people that consume things like ethanol. Corn syrup is in everything, but that doesn't mean that we're like, it's a necessity for us. It's kind of like a hidden necessity in the food chain. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud. Anything you said to defend that would be fine. I didn't ask you to because I didn't write this out really well. I'm just thinking about all the potential things I could ask if I were trying to wrap together everything you know about elasticity, government, and perfect competition. That price affects our individual over here, Farmer Jean. She's the average farmer. She's got her marginal cost curve, which is related to things like her tractor, her fuel, her labor, but also what she could be doing with her time. So she chooses to plant this much corn. And in the long run equilibrium, she's not making any economic profit as a corn farmer. She's making just as much growing corn as she would be growing soybeans. So she could be in the black, making tons of cash, but she's just as well off in this occupation as in her alternatives. Because if she were better off and she's the representative farmer, she would attract entrants, which would lower her. So that's where we start. Then, she makes a very good case, which is, hey, I'm not making any economic profit. Farming in America is hard work. I deserve a subsidy. So the government pays her a subsidy, which shifts the supply curve because it was paid to sellers. That's going to increase the quantity of corn in the global market. It's going to increase the price for sellers like Jean, decrease the price for buyers. It's going to cause this deadweight loss, which I showed you with letters earlier on. Which price should I plug into Jean's graph? Price of buyers or price of sellers? Which one is going to affect her? Is Farmer Jean a buyer or a seller of corn? It's a seller, right? So this higher price that farmers take home after the subsidy is the one that affects the individual farmer. She started off with a price down here. After the subsidy, her price goes up. That's the way we model subsidies in this class. They change your price. She'll react to that subsidy by planting more corn. In the short run, in the global market, we've got more corn. We've got buyers pay less for corn. Sellers take home more. The government spends lots of money. They lose money. Deadweight loss. Over here for Jean, in the short run, her price goes up and she plants more corn. Where that quantity hits her average total cost curve is her profit rectangle. She makes profit greater than zero. She loves the subsidy. It's going to happen in the long run. Entry. Perfect competition. Long run's always about entry or exit. People are going to enter until the profit goes to zero. They won't have any more incentive to plant corn. So if corn farming gets subsidized, soybean farmers are going to be like, corn's looking mighty nice right now. I'm going to replant all my fields with corn next year. Entry always shifts the supply curve up. So we need to get back to this price on the old demand curve, but with a subsidy. I don't know. I wouldn't be picky about how you drew this, but it might be something like this. So this is subsidy plus entry. So now with the subsidy, this is still going to be the wedge between the price for buyers and the price for sellers. So that means you might even need it to shift even more. But let's say, shift it a little bit more. That it goes all the way out here. So that now there's this new price that's now equal to the new price for sellers. And that is now what we plug back in until she's back where she started and profit is zero again. So we don't know what's going to happen exactly over here, but the supply is going to go up and the price for sellers is going to go down. And that is going to make Jean in the long run have a price that falls back down, quantity that falls back down, and a profit that's equal to zero again. There's a question of whether farm subsidies actually help farmers in the long run. If they attract entrants to farming and push commodity prices back down, did they actually really help anyone? The answer is there are barriers to farming in the US. It's not that easy to just enter because pretty much a lot of the land is owned at this point. So they could actually, by having a barrier to entry, keep some of that profit. But if you ask most farmers, they'll tell you they're barely breaking even. Like the subsidy is the thing that helps them break even. Okay, so let's just think about the short run subsidy in blue because that was easier. And C says, discuss how the deadweight loss from the subsidy might be justified or worsened depending on the carbon footprint of corn agriculture. So what I think is that there is a negative carbon externality from corn agriculture. I mean, the corn is a carbon sink, but usually large scale agriculture is a much worse carbon sink than the ecosystem that used to be there. So that means that by transforming land for planting corn, if it used to be prairie or it used to be pasture or it used to be probably not a forest, we're actually sequestering less carbon than we used to. I would either give you an article to find this, or I wouldn't assume that you would know all of the ins and outs of this, but you could assume that corn has a positive externality because, you know, it's a plant. But if this is just the market for corn, and we have supply and demand, and this is the market wants to do, this is the market price, and then we had the subsidy that made more corn and caused this deadweight loss. If there's actually a negative externality from corn, probably is in the production of it and not in the consumption of it, then that would mean that what society wants is less corn than the market was doing, right? So the market was here, the subsidy by the government moved it there, but what society actually wanted was for there to be less corn planted, less large-scale agriculture, more natural ecosystems. Then what society wants is less corn at higher prices. And the subsidy is causing there to be higher prices for the sellers, which is bad because that over subsidizes production, and lower prices for the buyers, which is really bad because those prices don't reflect the true cost of the corn. Especially if you think about like the ethanol implications of burning corn. So corn is like a biofuel in that, you know, it has a life cycle, it's not a fossil fuel, but it also has some carbon offsets while it's grown, less than a natural ecosystem. But then it has large carbon impact when it's burned. So if there's a negative externality, this would be the additional deadweight loss from the market quantity. Once we move to the subsidy quantity, we've got this deadweight loss. So this rainbow, this is just like the externality deadweight loss that we would have to add to the taxpayer, our story about the opportunity cost of taxpayer dollars in green. The subsidy deadweight loss, which was the taxpayer money opportunity cost. So if corn has a negative externality, the subsidy makes it much worse. Right? It's not a deadweight loss swap like a Pigovian policy would be. Because if there's a negative externality, what we should be doing is putting a tax on corn. And instead we use the wrong policy. So we're getting more of it than we wanted. And that's making the deadweight loss, the inefficiency worse. Does that make sense? If you, my graph looks crazy, I could redraw it, but like you wouldn't necessarily need to have the graph as long as you had that intuition. Although I think the graph kind of helps and it's kind of cool. That's just like an initial example of how we start pulling in stuff from the first exam to the second exam to the last exam. There's not like a million iterations of how I could do that, but a really amazing way to study would be to try and come up with questions for yourself that force you to interweave those things. Any last specific questions or things you want to see in the last 5 minutes, or got more urgent things to do?
I'm all set.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Jamie. Okay, well, good luck. Feel free to email if you have any questions that come up, and I'll hopefully see you on Zoom on Monday. That's tomorrow. Have a good one.
Thank you. Have a good Thanksgiving.
Thanks.